I'm Dorothy Simmons, 73. A retired maritime historian who married into one of Boston's oldest shipping families. For decades, I've endured their eye rolls whenever I mentioned my late husband James's great-grandfather, who perished on the Titanic in 1912. Ancient history, Dorothy, they'd say, dismissing my research as an old woman's obsession. Focus on the present, not dusty old stories. But when the Maritime Museum called last Tuesday with news about a recently discovered passenger manifest, everything changed. What they found wasn't just a name, it was evidence of a family secret so devastating, it would shatter the Whitmore legacy forever. And suddenly, my ancient history became their very urgent present. Before we jump back in, tell me where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. If you've ever felt dismissed by family who underestimated your knowledge, like this video for stories of truth, vindication, and the power of never giving up on what matters. The Whitmore family portrait from 1910 hangs in the main hallway of their Beacon Hill mansion, a constant reminder of their supposedly noble heritage. Thomas Whitmore stands proudly in the center, his wife Eleanor beside him, their 3 children arranged formally around them. It's a beautiful piece, really the kind of portrait that speaks of old money, respectability, and tragic loss. Every time I pass it, I'm reminded of how I came to be part of this family 45 years ago. I was Dorothy Chen then, a young maritime historian fresh from graduate school, working on my dissertation about passenger ships in the early 1900s. James Whitmore was completing his law degree at Harvard, and we met at a lecture about the Titanic disaster. He was handsome, intelligent, and surprisingly interested in my research. Most men of his social standing found academic women intimidating, but James was different. He listened when I spoke about maritime history, asked thoughtful questions, and never made me feel like my passion was frivolous. When he proposed 6 months later, I knew I was marrying into Boston aristocracy. The Whitmores weren't just wealthy, they were institution wealthy. Old shipping money that had survived the Depression, diversified into real estate and manufacturing, and maintained their social standing through careful marriages and strategic philanthropy. Thomas Whitmore, James's great-grandfather, was the family's most revered ancestor, the tragic hero who died on the Titanic, leaving behind a grieving widow and 3 small children. Great-grandfather Thomas was a true gentleman. James used to tell me during our early years together, he was traveling to Boston to finalize a shipping contract that would have made the family fortune. When the ship went down, he helped women and children into lifeboats before going down with the ship. A real hero. The family had preserved every document related to Thomas's life and death. There were letters he'd written to his wife before the voyage, business correspondence about the Boston deal, and even a telegram from the White Star Line confirming his death. The family treated these artifacts like religious relics, storing them in a climate-controlled safe in the library. I was fascinated by them from the beginning, but always felt like an outsider looking in. James supported my interest in family history, even when other family members found it excessive. His mother, the formidable Margaret Whitmore, tolerated my questions about Thomas with barely concealed impatience. "Dorothy, dear," she'd say in that tone that made dear sound like an insult. "Dwelling on the past won't bring him back. We honor his memory by living well, not by obsessing over old papers." But I wasn't obsessing, I was researching. There's a difference, though the family never seemed to understand it. As a maritime historian, I knew the Titanic story inside and out. I'd studied passenger manifests, survivor accounts, and ship records for years. Thomas Whitmore's story fit perfectly into the narrative of heroic sacrifice that surrounded the disaster. Almost too perfectly. Over the years, I tried to share my professional insights about the Titanic with the family, but they showed little interest. "We know what happened to great-grandfather," James's brother Robert once said dismissively. "He died a hero. What more is there to discuss?" What more, indeed? That question haunted me for decades, especially after James passed away 5 years ago. Without his gentle support, the family's dismissal of my interests became more pronounced. I was no longer James's wife. The maritime historian I was just Dorothy, the elderly woman who couldn't let go of the past. The family portrait seems to mock me now, Thomas's painted eyes following me as I walk past. He looks so dignified, so noble, the perfect patriarch for a family built on honor and sacrifice, but something about his expression always bothered me. There's a sharpness there, a calculating look that doesn't quite match the heroic narrative. I used to think it was just the painter's interpretation, but now I wonder if there was more to Thomas Whitmore than his grieving family ever knew. My research journal sits on my desk, leather-bound and filled with decades of meticulous notes, theories, and questions that nobody in the Whitmore family wanted to hear. Page after page of careful documentation, cross-references, and maritime records that I'd compiled over 40 years of marriage. Each entry represents hours of work, trips to archives, correspondence with historians, and late nights spent piecing together the puzzle of the Titanic disaster. The family gatherings were the worst. Every Thanksgiving, Christmas, and birthday became an opportunity for subtle mockery of my hobby. I remember one particularly painful Easter dinner when my daughter-in-law Patricia made a show of checking her watch while I was explaining some new research about passenger accommodations. "Dorothy, honestly," Patricia said, her voice dripping with condescension, "how many times can you tell the same story? Great-grandfather Thomas died on the Titanic. It's tragic, it's noble, it's history. Can't we talk about something relevant for once?" The table fell silent. My son Michael shifted uncomfortably in his chair, clearly embarrassed by his mother's academic interests. James's nephew David smirked into his wineglass. Even the grandchildren, usually polite, seemed to share the adults' impatience with Grandma. Dorothy's obsession. "I'm not telling stories," I said quietly, my voice steadier than I felt. "I'm conducting historical research. There's a difference." "Research?" Patricia laughed, the sound sharp and dismissive. "You're a retired professor poking around in old documents. That's not research. That's nostalgia." The word retired stung particularly hard. Yes, I'd retired from teaching at Boston University 15 years ago, but my credentials hadn't evaporated with my pension. I'd spent 30 years in academia, published papers on maritime history, and consulted for museums and historical societies. But to Patricia, retirement meant my expertise had an expiration date. Michael, my own son, didn't defend me. Instead, he gave me that look, the one that said, "Please don't embarrass us again." He'd inherited his father's diplomatic nature, but none of his respect for my work. "Mom," he said gently, "maybe we could table the history lesson. It's Easter, after all." I closed my mouth and spent the rest of the meal listening to conversations about golf handicaps and stock portfolios. Important things, present-day things, relevant things. But the dismissal wasn't limited to holiday gatherings. Patricia made it clear that she found my research not just boring but somehow unseemly. "It's morbid," she told me once, cornering me in the kitchen during a family barbecue. "All this focus on death and tragedy. It's not healthy for a woman your age, a woman my age." As if turning 70 had somehow invalidated my education and experience. As if my doctoral dissertation on passenger ship safety regulations had become irrelevant because I'd reached some arbitrary number of birthdays. The condescension was relentless, but subtle. Patricia would change the subject whenever I mentioned my research. Michael would pat my hand and suggest I take up gardening or book clubs instead. Robert's wife would make jokes about Dorothy's detective work that made everyone laugh except me. They treated me like a sweet but senile grandmother whose harmless delusions should be humored but not taken seriously. When I mentioned discrepancies in passenger records, they'd nod politely and immediately start talking about something else. When I pointed out inconsistencies in Thomas's story, they'd exchange those looks, the kind that said, "There she goes again." The loneliness was overwhelming. James had been my advocate, my supporter, my intellectual companion. He'd listened to my theories, asked thoughtful questions, and never made me feel foolish for caring about historical accuracy. Without him, I was just an elderly woman with too much time on her hands and an unhealthy fixation on the past. I began to doubt myself. Maybe Patricia was right. Maybe I was just a lonely widow clinging to old papers because I couldn't accept that my productive years were behind me. Maybe my questions about Thomas Whitmore were just an old woman's attempt to feel relevant in a family that had moved on without her. But late at night, alone in my study, I'd open my research journal and remember why I'd started this work in the first place. The inconsistencies were real. The gaps in Thomas's story were significant. The timeline didn't quite add up. These weren't the fantasies of a senile old woman, they were the observations of a trained historian who'd spent decades studying maritime records. I'd built my career on asking difficult questions and following evidence wherever it led. Just because I was older didn't mean I'd lost the ability to think critically or recognize when something didn't fit. The family's dismissal hurt, but it didn't change the facts. And the facts about Thomas Whitmore had never quite made sense. The research journal became my sanctuary, the one place where my questions were valid and my observations mattered. Page after page of careful documentation, waiting for the day when someone would finally listen to what I'd discovered. I just never imagined that day would come from a phone call that would change everything. The Maritime Museum's business card had been sitting on my desk for 3 years, a small reminder of the professional respect I'd once commanded. Dr. Sarah Chen, the curator of maritime history, had contacted me when they were developing their Titanic Centennial exhibition. Unlike my family, she'd treated my expertise with genuine reverence. Consulting me on passenger manifests and survivor accounts, the exhibition had been a success, but our professional relationship had remained cordial rather than close. So when my phone rang last Tuesday morning and I heard her voice, urgent and excited, I was surprised by the intensity of her call. "Dorothy, I need you to come in immediately," Dr. Chen said, her usual professional composure replaced by barely contained excitement. "We've received a donation that changes everything we thought we knew about the Titanic passenger records." I set down my coffee cup, my hand trembling slightly. "What kind of donation?" "A private collector in England died last month. His estate included a trunk full of maritime documents that his family assumed were worthless. But Dorothy, there are passenger manifests here that we've never seen before. Ship registry documents, immigration records, and your family name is all over them." My heart began to race. The Whitmore name. Not just the name-detailed records about Thomas Whitmore that contradict everything in the official White Star Line documentation. "Dorothy, I think we may have uncovered one of the most significant maritime historical discoveries in decades, and you're the only person qualified to help us understand what we're looking at." The respect in her voice was intoxicating. After years of being dismissed by my own family, here was a professional colleague who valued my expertise enough to call me first. "I'll be there within the hour," I said, already reaching for my coat. "Dorothy," Dr. Chen said before hanging up, "prepare yourself. What we've found is going to shock you." The drive to the museum felt surreal. Boston's familiar streets seemed different somehow, as if the city itself was holding its breath. I'd made this journey hundreds of times over the years, but today felt momentous. The business card lay on my passenger seat. Dr. Chen's contact information, suddenly the most important piece of paper in my life. I thought about calling Michael or Patricia, letting them know about this potentially significant discovery. But something held me back. For decades, they'd dismissed my research as ancient history, irrelevant to their modern lives. They'd made it clear that my expertise was more embarrassment than asset. So why should I share this moment with them before I understood what it meant? The museum's parking lot was nearly empty on this Tuesday morning. I walked through the familiar entrance, past the maritime exhibits I'd helped curate, toward Dr. Chen's office. My reflection in the glass display cases showed an elderly woman with silver hair and intelligent eyes, someone who'd spent a lifetime studying the sea's mysteries. Today, I felt like that lifetime of knowledge was finally about to matter. Dr. Chen met me at her office door, her expression a mixture of excitement and concern. She was a woman in her 40s, impeccably dressed and academically rigorous everything I'd been at her age. "Dorothy, thank you for coming so quickly. I know this is unusual, but when I saw these documents, I knew you had to be the first person to examine them." She led me to a conference room where white cotton gloves and archival tools were laid out on a pristine table. In the center sat a manila folder thick with documents, some yellowed with age, others surprisingly well. The collector's family said these had been in their grandfather's possession for over a century, Dr. Chen explained. He was apparently obsessed with maritime disasters and had contacts throughout the shipping industry. Some of these documents appear to be original ship records that were never supposed to leave company archives. I put on the white gloves, my fingers steady despite my racing heart. "What specifically relates to Thomas Whitmore?" Dr. Chen opened the folder and pulled out a document that made my breath catch. It was a passenger manifest, but not from the Titanic. The ship's name at the top read SS Carpathia, and there, in clear handwriting, was a name that made my world shift. "Thomas Whitmore, Boston." "The Carpathia," I whispered. "That was the rescue ship." "Exactly. The ship that picked up Titanic survivors." But Dorothy, look at the date on this manifest. I studied the document, my trained eye taking in every detail. The date was April 18, 1912, 3 days after the Titanic sank. But this wasn't a list of survivors. This was a regular passenger manifest for people who had boarded the Carpathia in New York for a scheduled voyage to Boston. He wasn't rescued, I said slowly, the implications beginning to dawn on me. He was a paying passenger. That's what we thought too. But it gets stranger. Look at this. Dr. Chen pulled out another document, this one from the Boston Immigration Office. It showed Thomas Whitmore arriving in Boston on April 21, 1912, aboard the Carpathia, not as a traumatized survivor, but as a regular passenger with proper documentation and declared business purposes. I stared at the papers, my mind racing through decades of family history. This doesn't make sense. Thomas Whitmore died on the Titanic. We have the death certificate, the insurance settlement, the family correspondence. I know, Dr. Chen said gently. That's why I called you. As the family's expert on Thomas Whitmore, I need your help understanding how these documents fit with the official record. But I was already beginning to understand, and the realization was terrifying. If Thomas Whitmore had survived the Titanic disaster, if he'd actually been on a different ship entirely, then everything the family believed about their noble ancestor was a lie. The hero who'd died saving women and children, the tragic figure who'd founded their fortune through sacrifice, none of it was true. Dr. Chen, I said, my voice barely above a whisper, I think we need to see everything in this collection, every document, every record, every piece of evidence, because if these papers are authentic, then my family has been living a lie for over a century. The ship's registry document lay before me like a smoking gun, its official seals and careful handwriting destroying everything I'd believed about my late husband's family. Dr. Chen had pulled it from the bottom of the donated collection, and its contents made my hands shake despite 40 years of handling historical documents. This is the manifest for the SS Mauritania, departing Liverpool on April 8, 1912, Dr. Chen said, her voice carefully neutral. 4 days before the Titanic sailed, I studied the passenger list with growing horror. There, in clear black ink, was the name Thomas Whitmore, along with his cabin assignment, destination, and arrival date. Boston, April 15, 1912. The same day the Titanic sank. He was never on the Titanic, I whispered, the words feeling like betrayal, even as I spoke them. He was on a completely different ship. Dr. Chen nodded grimly. The Mauritania was a Cunard Line vessel, not White Star. It was actually considered more luxurious than the Titanic, and significantly more expensive. According to this manifest, Thomas Whitmore had a first-class cabin and was traveling alone. I turned the document over, looking for any sign of forgery or alteration, but my trained eye found none. The paper was authentic, the ink was periodic, and the official stamps were legitimate. This was real. But we have documentation of his death, I said desperately. Death certificates, insurance settlements, family correspondence mourning his loss. I know, that's what makes this so extraordinary. Dr. Chen pulled out another folder, this one containing what appeared to be immigration records. Thomas Whitmore didn't just survive his Atlantic crossing, he arrived in Boston exactly when he was supposed to, 3 days before the Titanic disaster was even reported in American newspapers. The immigration record was devastating in its mundane detail. Thomas Whitmore, age 34, British citizen, declaring $2,000 in assets and listing his occupation as merchant. He'd passed through Boston immigration on April 15, 1912. Just another businessman arriving for routine commercial activities. Dr. Chen, I said, my voice cracking, this means the family's entire foundation story is false. Thomas Whitmore didn't die heroically on the Titanic. He didn't go down with the ship saving women and children. He was never on the ship at all. That's what the evidence suggests. But Dorothy, there's more, much more. She pulled out a thick envelope containing what appeared to be business correspondence. The letterhead read Whitmore Maritime Enterprises, Boston, and the dates ranged from May 1912 through December 1913. Letters about ship purchases, cargo manifests, and business partnerships. All signed by Thomas Whitmore. He was conducting business for over a year after his supposed death, Dr. Chen said, building what appears to have been a significant shipping operation here in Boston. I picked up one of the letters, dated June 1912. It was addressed to a Liverpool shipping company, discussing the transfer of assets from England to Boston. The tone was businesslike and confident, written by a man who was very much alive and actively building an empire. But why? I asked, though I was beginning to understand. Why would he fake his death? Why would he abandon his family in England? Dr. Chun's expression was sympathetic but serious. That's what we need to figure out. But Dorothy, I have to ask, when I called you about this discovery, you seemed shocked. Are you telling me that in all your years of research into your family's history, you never encountered any evidence that contradicted the official story? I thought about my research journal, filled with decades of questions and inconsistencies, the timeline that never quite fit, the business records that seemed too convenient, the rapid establishment of the family fortune immediately after Thomas's supposed death. I had questions, I admitted, things that didn't quite add up, but I was always dismissed when I brought them up. The family insisted I was over things, looking for mysteries where none existed. What kind of questions? How did Thomas build such a successful shipping business so quickly after arriving in Boston? How did he have the capital to make such large investments? And why were there so few personal effects recovered from the Titanic if he was really on board? Dr. Chen nodded. All valid questions. Questions that a trained historian would naturally ask. But every time I raised them, I was told I was being morbid, obsessing over ancient history. My own family treated my expertise like a hobby, my questions like the ramblings of a senile old woman. Dorothy, Dr. Chen said gently, I think your family dismissed your questions because they were afraid of what you might discover. The evidence in this collection suggests that Thomas Whitmore didn't just survive the Titanic, he used the disaster as cover for what appears to have been an elaborate fraud. The word fraud hit me like a physical blow. The noble ancestor, the heroic sacrifice, the tragic foundation of the family fortune, all of it built on deception. And I'd been the one asking the uncomfortable questions that could have exposed the truth decades ago. My research was right, I said. The realization both vindicating and devastating, all those years of being dismissed, of being told I was wasting my time on ancient history, I was actually uncovering the truth. You were, and now we have the documentation to prove it. I looked at the pile of evidence spread across the table, passenger manifests, immigration records, business correspondence, and official documents that painted a picture of a man who had carefully orchestrated his own disappearance. Thomas Whitmore hadn't died on the Titanic, he'd used the tragedy to escape whatever life he'd left behind in England. What do we do now? I asked. Dr. Chen's expression was grave. That depends on you, Dorothy. This is your family's history. These documents will eventually become part of the public record. They're too historically significant to keep private. But how we handle the revelation, how we present the evidence, that's something we need to discuss carefully. I thought about Patricia's dismissive laughter, Michael's embarrassed sighs, and decades of being treated like a foolish old woman with too much time on her hands. The same people who'd mocked my research were about to learn that I'd been right all along. I want to see everything, I said firmly. Every document, every piece of evidence. If I'm going to confront my family with this truth, I need to understand exactly what Thomas Whitmore did and why he did it. Dr. Chen smiled. The first genuine smile I'd seen from her all morning. I was hoping you'd say that. Because Dorothy, I think we're about to rewrite maritime history. The immigration records from 1912 told a story that made my stomach churn. Dr. Chen had arranged them chronologically, and together they painted a picture of calculated deception that went far beyond simple fraud. Thomas Whitmore hadn't just faked his death, he'd systematically erased his past and built a new identity on the tragedy of others. Look at this entry, Dr. Chen said, pointing to a document dated April 20th, 1912, 5 days after the Titanic sank. Thomas Whitmore applied for emergency documentation, claiming his original papers had been lost in the disaster. I studied the immigration form, my historians eye noting the careful handwriting and deliberate word choices. Thomas had told officials that he'd been booked on the Titanic but had missed the sailing due to illness. He claimed to have taken the next available ship, the Mauritania, and had arrived in Boston, to discover that his luggage and documents had gone down with the ship he'd supposedly missed. He used the disaster as cover, I said, the pieces falling into place. Everyone was so focused on the tragedy that no one questioned his story carefully. Exactly. And look at this. Dr. Chen pulled out another document, this one from the Boston City Registry. 3 weeks after his arrival, Thomas Whitmore registered a new business, Whitmore Maritime Enterprises. He listed himself as a widower whose wife had died in England and claimed he was starting fresh in America to escape his grief. The calculated nature of the deception was breathtaking. Thomas had created an entirely new backstory that positioned him as a sympathetic figure while eliminating any connections to his past. No wife to contact, no family to verify his story, no business partners to ask uncomfortable questions. But why? I asked, though I was beginning to suspect the answer. What was he running from in England? Dr. Chen's expression was grim. That's where it gets even more disturbing. She pulled out a telegram, yellowed with age, and bearing the seal of the Liverpool Metropolitan Police. It was dated April 10, 1912, 2 days before the Titanic sailed. Thomas Whitmore was wanted for questioning in connection with the collapse of Whitmore Brothers Shipping Company, she read aloud. The company had declared bankruptcy 3 months earlier, leaving dozens of investors destitute. There were allegations of embezzlement, fraud, and the misappropriation of pension funds. The telegram was addressed to the Boston Police Department, requesting assistance in locating Thomas Whitmore, who had fled England with what appeared to be significant stolen assets. The timing was damning. Thomas had left Liverpool just days before the police had issued the warrant. He was a criminal, I whispered. He stole money from investors and employees, then used the Titanic disaster to disappear. It gets worse, Dr. Chen said quietly. She pulled out a newspaper clipping from the Liverpool Daily Post, dated May 15, 1912. The headline read, "Missing shipping magnate, feared dead on Titanic widow, and children left destitute." The article described Thomas Whitmore as a respected businessman who had apparently perished in the disaster. It mentioned his grieving widow, Eleanor, and their 3 young children, who had been left with nothing after the company's collapse. The community had rallied to support the family, raising funds for the widow and orphans of the Titanic victim. He had a family, I said, my voice barely audible. A wife and 3 children in England. They thought he was dead, and while they were struggling to survive, he was in Boston building a new fortune with the money he'd stolen from his investors. I felt sick. The family portrait that hung in the Whitmore mansion that wasn't Thomas's American family. That was his English family, the wife and children he'd abandoned. The noble ancestor we'd honored for over a century was actually a thief, who'd used one of history's greatest tragedies to escape justice. The timing explains everything, I said, my mind racing through decades of family history. Thomas arrived in Boston in April 1912 with stolen money and no past to investigate. The Titanic disaster dominated the news for months, and anyone claiming to be a victim received sympathy and support. He used that sympathy to establish himself in Boston society. Dr. Chen nodded, and by the time anyone might have questioned his story, he'd already married into Boston society and established himself as a legitimate businessman who would doubt a Titanic survivor. I thought about Eleanor Whitmore, the woman Thomas had married in Boston in 1913. She'd been a young widow herself, her first husband having died in an industrial accident. She'd been vulnerable, grieving, and financially insecure, perfect prey for a man like Thomas. He didn't just steal money, I said. He stole an entire identity. He let his real family believe he was dead, while he built a new life on their suffering. The documents before me told a story of breathtaking callousness, while his real wife and children mourned his death and struggled with poverty. Thomas Whitmore was courting Boston society, using his tragic backstory to gain sympathy and business opportunities. He'd parlayed his stolen assets into a shipping empire, all while playing the role of the grieving widower who'd lost everything on the Titanic. "Dorothy," Dr. Chen said gently, "I know this is devastating, but there's more, much more." She pulled out a thick folder labeled Business Correspondence, 1912 a 1913. The letters inside detailed Thomas's rapid expansion in Boston, his strategic partnerships, and his careful cultivation of influential connections. But what caught my attention was a letter dated December 1913, written in Thomas's hand. "My dear Eleanor," it began, "I find myself thinking often of my dear departed wife, also named Eleanor, who perished along with all my worldly possessions on that terrible night. How fitting that I should find love again with someone who bears her blessed name." The letter was addressed to Eleanor Whitmore, the Boston widow who would become Thomas's second wife. But the dear departed wife he referenced was very much alive in Liverpool, raising his children, and struggling to survive. He was using his real wife's name to court his new wife, I said, disgusted. He was romanticizing the woman he'd abandoned. It gets worse. Look at this. Dr. Chun showed me a business ledger from 1913, detailing Thomas's investments and expenditures. The amounts were staggering enough to buy property, establish a shipping business, and live lavishly in Boston society. But the source of the funds was noted in careful handwriting. Liverpool pension fund liquidation and investor bond conversion. He was literally spending his victims' money, I said. The pensions of working people, the life savings of investors. He was using it all to build his new life. The scope of Thomas Whitmore's deception was overwhelming. He hadn't just faked his death, he'd orchestrated an elaborate fraud that had destroyed dozens of lives in England while establishing his fortune in America. And for over a century, my family had celebrated him as a hero. The bank records from 1912 spread across Dr. Chen's conference table like evidence at a crime scene. Each document revealed another layer of Thomas Whitmore's elaborate deception, and I found myself reconstructing the timeline of fraud with the same methodical precision I'd once applied to legitimate historical research. The deposits began 3 days after his arrival in Boston, I said, tracing the financial trail with my finger. April 18, 1912. 5 separate transactions totaling $47,000, an enormous sum for that time. Dr. Chun had pulled the records from the donated collection, and they painted a picture of systematic financial manipulation. Thomas had opened accounts at 3 different Boston banks, spreading his stolen assets to avoid detection. The amounts were staggering, equivalent to over $1 million in today's currency. Look at the deposit slips, Dr. Chen said. He converted British pounds to American dollars, but the exchange was processed through a private broker, not through official banking channels. He was laundering the money. I studied the handwritten records, my historian's training helping me understand the careful choreography of Thomas's scheme. He'd arrived in Boston with stolen assets, converted them to American currency through untraceable transactions, and immediately began investing in legitimate businesses. Within 6 months, he'd established himself as a successful shipping entrepreneur. The genius of his plan was the timing, I said, the admiration in my voice making me feel sick. The Titanic disaster dominated international news for months. Immigration officials, bank clerks, business partners, everyone was focused on the tragedy. No one was scrutinizing the background of a supposed disaster victim. The financial records revealed the calculated nature of Thomas's deception. He'd used his tragic backstory to gain sympathy and business opportunities. Presenting himself as a grieving widower who'd lost everything but was determined to rebuild, Boston society had embraced him, offering partnerships, investments, and social connections that would have taken years to establish legitimately. He was smart enough to lose money initially, Dr. Chen observed, pointing to several transactions from late 1912, small losses that made him seem like a legitimate businessman learning the American market, not someone with insider knowledge and unlimited capital. The pattern was clear once I understood what to look for. Thomas had deliberately made rookie mistakes, lost money on obvious bad investments, and presented himself as a grieving amateur trying to honor his dead wife's memory by rebuilding their fortune. The performance had been masterful, but it was the insurance records that truly revealed the scope of his fraud. Hidden among the banking documents was correspondence with 3 separate insurance companies, all claiming compensation for losses suffered in the Titanic disaster. He filed claims for personal effects, business documents, and even life insurance on his deceased wife, I said, reading through the paperwork. He collected money for belongings that never existed, for a wife who was very much alive in Liverpool. The insurance fraud alone had netted Thomas over $15,000, money he'd used to establish his shipping business and court Boston society. He'd played the role of the tragic widower so convincingly that insurance adjusters had processed his claims with minimal investigation. Dorothy, Dr. Chen said quietly, there's something else. Something I think you need to see. She pulled out a newspaper clipping from the Boston Herald, dated November 1913. The headline read, "Shipping magnate announces engagement to local widow Titanic survivor, finds love again." The article described Thomas's engagement to Eleanor Whitmore, praising his courage in opening his heart after such devastating loss. It detailed his tragic backstory, his heroic survival, and his determination to build a new life in America. The piece was sympathetic, romantic, and completely false. He was using the media to reinforce his false identity, I said. Every public appearance, every business deal, every social engagement was carefully crafted to support his fabricated story. But it was the final document in the banking records that made my blood run cold. It was a letter from Thomas to his business partner, dated January 1914, discussing their expansion plans. The tone was casual, almost boastful, as Thomas described his success in Boston society. "The Americans are remarkably trusting," he'd written. "They see a man who has suffered tragedy and lost everything, and they open their hearts and wallets. I have built in 2 years what might have taken 20 in England. And all because I had the wisdom to choose my tragedy carefully." The callousness was breathtaking. Thomas wasn't just a thief, he was a predator who'd used genuine human sympathy as a weapon. He'd exploited the compassion of an entire community, using their empathy to build his fortune, while his real family struggled in poverty. He was proud of what he'd done, I said, my voice shaking with anger. He saw the destruction of his family and his victims as a business achievement. Dr. Chun nodded grimly. And it worked. By 1914, Thomas Whitmore was one of Boston's most successful shipping entrepreneurs. He'd married into society, established business partnerships with the city's elite, and created a fortune that would sustain his family for generations. I thought about the family portrait hanging in the Beacon Hill mansion, the one that showed Thomas with his beloved wife Eleanor and their children. Those children my late husband's grandparents had been raised believing their father was a hero who'd survived the Titanic through courage and determination. The entire family foundation is built on lies, I said. Not just the Titanic story, but everything. Thomas's success, his reputation, his marriage, all of it was constructed on fraud and abandonment. The banking records revealed the mathematical precision of Thomas's deception. He'd calculated exactly how much money he needed to establish himself in Boston society, how much sympathy his tragic story would generate, and how much time he had before anyone might investigate his background. The plan had been executed flawlessly. "Dorothy," Dr. Chen said, "I have to ask, what are you going to do with this information?" I looked at the evidence spread before me: bank records, insurance claims, newspaper clippings, and correspondence that destroyed a century of family mythology. The same people who'd dismissed my research as ancient history were about to learn that their entire identity was built on a lie. "I'm going to do what I should have done decades ago," I said. "I'm going to follow the evidence wherever it leads, no matter how uncomfortable the truth might be." The irony was overwhelming. For 40 years, I'd been told to stop dwelling on the past, to focus on the present instead of obsessing over old documents. But those old documents had been trying to tell me the truth all along. Thomas Whitmore's story had never made sense because it was fiction. The questions I'd been asking for decades were the right questions. I'd just been asking them to the wrong people. Now, I had the answers. And the answers were going to destroy everything my family believed about themselves. The property deed from 1913 represented more than just a real estate transaction. It was evidence of how Thomas Whitmore had converted his stolen assets into legitimate American wealth. Dr. Chun had found it tucked between banking records, and its contents revealed the methodical way Thomas had laundered his criminal proceeds into respectable investments. The Beacon Hill property was purchased for $12,000 in cash, I said, studying the deed that had established the family's prestigious address. "That's where my son Michael lives now, where the family still gathers for holidays." It was bought with money stolen from English pensioners. The deed was signed by Thomas Whitmore and Eleanor Whitmore, his new American wife, just 6 months after their wedding. But the source of the funds was noted in the margin: Liverpool liquidation proceeds. Thomas had been meticulous in his record keeping, perhaps because he'd needed to track the origins of his various assets. Dr. Chen had arranged the property records chronologically, showing how Thomas had systematically converted his stolen money into American real estate, business investments, and social capital. The pattern was clear and devastating. "He bought the shipping warehouse in March 1913, she said, pointing to another deed, the downtown office building in June, the summer estate in Newport in August. All cash purchases, all funded by theft." I calculated the amounts in my head, converting the 1913 values to modern equivalents. Thomas had purchased over $2 million worth of property in today's currency, establishing the foundation of what would become the Whitmore family fortune. Every brick, every beam, Every dollar of equity had been paid for with money stolen from his victims. The warehouse is still operating, I said, thinking about the family's continuing business interests. Michael sits on the board of directors. Patricia handles the charitable foundation. They're all living off the proceeds of their ancestors' crimes. But it was the insurance documentation that revealed the full scope of Thomas's fraud. Hidden among the property records were policies he'd purchased on his new investments, all of them describing him as a Titanic survivor who'd lost everything in the disaster. The insurance companies had offered him preferential rates, seeing him as a sympathetic figure who deserved support. He was using his false identity to get better business terms, I said, reading through the policy documents. Insurance companies, banks, business partners, they all gave him favorable treatment because they thought he was a disaster victim. The paperwork showed how Thomas had leveraged his fabricated tragedy into financial advantage. He'd received loans at reduced interest rates, insurance policies at discounted premiums, and business partnerships that would have been impossible for an unknown immigrant. His fictional suffering had become a valuable commodity. "Look at this," Dr. Chen said, pulling out a letter from the Boston Chamber of Commerce. They made him a founding member of their disaster relief committee, helping other unfortunate victims of maritime accidents. He was literally profiting from the same type of fraud he'd committed. The letter was dated 1914, inviting Thomas to serve on a committee dedicated to helping victims of shipping disasters. The irony was sickening. Thomas Whitmore, master of maritime fraud, had been asked to help legitimate victims of the same tragedies he'd exploited. But the business records revealed even more disturbing patterns. Thomas hadn't just stolen money and disappeared. He'd used his new identity to prey on other vulnerable people. The shipping business he'd established had a troubling history of taking advantage of immigrants and desperate investors. "These contracts are unconscionable," I said, reading through agreements Thomas had signed with newly arrived immigrants. He was charging them triple the normal rates for shipping services, exploiting their lack of knowledge about American business practices. The pattern was consistent. Thomas had identified vulnerable populations and systematically exploited them: Irish immigrants, Italian workers, widows seeking to ship goods to family overseas. All of them had been overcharged, manipulated, and sometimes defrauded by the man they trusted because of his tragic backstory. He was running the same type of schemes in America that he'd run in England, Dr. Chen observed. The only difference was that his American victims couldn't complain to authorities because they thought he was helping them out of the goodness of his heart. The business ledgers showed how Thomas had used his reputation as a Titanic survivor to gain access to immigrant communities, church groups, and charitable organizations. He'd presented himself as someone who understood suffering and wanted to help others overcome their own hardships. The performance had been masterful and profitable. The charitable donations were tax write-offs, I said, discovering another layer of deception. He was donating money to disaster relief funds, then claiming credit for his generosity while using the donations to reduce his tax burden. Thomas had been particularly active in supporting Titanic survivor funds, contributing money to help fellow victims while knowing that his own survival story was completely fabricated. The donations had served multiple purposes. They'd enhanced his reputation, provided tax benefits, and reinforced his false identity. But it was the correspondence with his business partners that revealed the most damning evidence of Thomas's continuing criminal mindset. Letters from 1915 and 1916 showed him discussing plans to expand his operations, using the same manipulative tactics that had made him successful in Boston. He was planning to establish similar businesses in New York and Philadelphia, I said, reading through the strategic planning documents. The same pattern: arrive as a tragic figure, gain community sympathy, exploit vulnerable populations, and build legitimate businesses on the proceeds. The letters detailed Thomas's analysis of different American cities, evaluating them based on their immigrant populations, business regulations, and potential for the type of exploitation he'd perfected in Boston. He'd approached fraud like a science, calculating the most efficient ways to convert sympathy into profit. "Dorothy," Dr. Chen said quietly, "there's something else. Something I think you need to understand before you confront your family." She pulled out a medical record from Boston General Hospital, dated 1918. Thomas Whitmore had been admitted for treatment of what appeared to be a nervous breakdown, brought on by what the doctors described as survivor's guilt and traumatic memories. He was treating his fictional trauma, I said, understanding the final piece of Thomas's deception. He'd convinced himself that his lies were real. The medical records showed extensive treatment for anxiety, depression, and what would now be recognized as post-traumatic stress disorder. But Thomas's trauma wasn't from surviving the Titanic. It was from the guilt of his crimes and the constant fear of discovery. By 1918, he'd been living the lie for 6 years, Dr. Chen said. Maybe he'd started to believe it himself. The hospital records painted a picture of a man tormented by his own deception, seeking treatment for suffering that was both real and entirely self-inflicted. He'd created a tragic identity to escape justice, but the weight of that false identity had eventually crushed him. The family fortune, I said, looking at the pile of evidence. Everything they're so proud of, it's all built on fraud, theft, and the exploitation of genuine tragedy. Thomas Whitmore didn't just steal money, he stole dignity, hope, and trust from everyone he touched. The documents before me told a story of systematic criminality that had shaped my family's identity for over a century. Every dollar of inherited wealth, every prestigious address, every social connection, all of it traced back to Thomas Whitmore's decision to use the Titanic disaster as cover for his crimes. And now, I had to decide what to do with that knowledge. The legal documents from 1912 sat in neat stacks on my dining room table, each pile representing another aspect of Thomas Whitmore's fraud. I'd spent 3 days organizing the evidence Dr. Chen had allowed me to photocopy, creating a comprehensive case file that would be impossible for my family to dismiss or deny. The insurance claims were the most damning. Thomas had filed detailed reports with 3 separate companies, describing personal effects, business documents, and even jewelry that had supposedly been lost when the Titanic sank. The claims were elaborate and specific, describing items that had never existed, purchases that had never been made, and losses that were completely fictional. Policy number 47,291, with Hartford Insurance. I read aloud to my empty dining room, practicing the presentation I would soon give to my family. Claimed loss of $3,500 in business documents and contracts. But Thomas Whitmore was never on the Titanic. These documents never existed. Each insurance claim had been processed with minimal investigation, a testament to the sympathy Thomas had generated with his tragic story. The companies had paid out over $15,000 in total money that Thomas had used to establish his shipping business and court Boston society. But the insurance fraud was just the beginning. The legal documents revealed a pattern of systematic deception that had continued for years after Thomas's arrival in America. He'd used his false identity to gain access to immigrant communities, charitable organizations, and business partnerships that would have been impossible for an unknown criminal. I'd spent 40 years asking questions about inconsistencies in Thomas's story, only to be dismissed as a senile old woman obsessing over ancient history. Now I had documentation that proved every instinct I'd had was correct. The timeline had never made sense because it was fiction. The business success had been too rapid because it was funded by theft. The family had celebrated a hero who was actually a criminal. The correspondence with Thomas's business partners revealed his calculating nature. Letters from 1913 and 1914 showed him discussing expansion plans with the same cold analysis he'd applied to his original fraud. He'd identified vulnerable populations, calculated their potential value, and systematically exploited their trust. My dear partner, I read from one letter, the Irish immigrants are particularly susceptible to our charitable approach. They respond well to fellow sufferers and are willing to pay premium rates for services they believe are provided out of sympathy rather than profit. The callousness was breathtaking. Thomas hadn't just stolen money, he'd weaponized human compassion, using people's empathy as a tool for exploitation. He'd built his fortune on the very virtues he'd abandoned. But preparing for the family confrontation required more than just organizing evidence. I needed to understand the emotional and psychological impact of what I was about to reveal. The Whitmore family identity was built on Thomas's supposed heroism, their social standing, their charitable work, their sense of themselves as honorable people. All of it would be destroyed by the truth. I thought about Patricia, my daughter, who'd spent 20 years dismissing my research as ancient history. She'd built her social life around the Whitmore family reputation, serving on charity boards and hosting fundraisers that celebrated their ancestors' sacrifice. Learning that Thomas was actually a criminal would devastate her carefully constructed world. Michael, my son, had inherited his father's diplomatic nature, but none of his respect for historical truth. He'd spent decades being embarrassed by his mother's obsession with family history, viewing my research as a hobby that reflected poorly on his professional reputation. Now he'd learned that his mother had been uncovering evidence of crimes that could still have legal implications. The financial documents were particularly troubling. Thomas's stolen assets had been invested in properties and businesses that still generated income for the family. The Beacon Hill mansion, the shipping warehouse, the charitable foundation, all of it was built on money stolen from English pensioners and investors. The moral implications are staggering, I said to my reflection in the dining room window, practicing the words I would soon speak to my family. We're not just inheriting Thomas's wealth, we're inheriting his crimes. Every dollar we've spent, every charity we've supported, every social advantage we've enjoyed, it's all been funded by theft. The legal ramifications were equally concerning. Statute of limitations laws would prevent criminal prosecution after a century, but civil claims might still be possible. The descendants of Thomas's victims in England could potentially seek restitution from his American estate. The family's wealth, their properties, their entire financial foundation could be at risk. But beyond the legal and financial implications, there was a deeper moral question. What did we owe to the truth? Thomas had built his fortune on the suffering of others, using genuine tragedy as cover for his crimes. His victims had included not just the investors and pensioners he'd robbed, but also the immigrants he'd exploited in America and the family he'd abandoned in England. I'd spent 3 days organizing the evidence, but I'd spent a lifetime preparing for this moment. Every question I'd asked, every inconsistency I'd noted, every time I'd been dismissed as a foolish old woman, all of it had led to this confrontation with the truth. The irony wasn't lost on me. The same family members who'd mocked my research were about to learn that my ancient history was actually a criminal investigation. The questions they'd found so tiresome were actually the key to understanding their own identity. I looked at the stacks of documents, each one representing another layer of deception that had shaped my family for over a century. The evidence was irrefutable, the implications were devastating, and the choice was mine. I could protect my family's comfortable lies, or I could honor the truth that had taken me a lifetime to uncover. The decision was actually simple. I'd spent 40 years being dismissed as an irrelevant old woman whose expertise didn't matter, but expertise had led me to this moment, and expertise demanded that I follow the evidence wherever it led, no matter how uncomfortable the destination. I picked up my phone and dialed Michael's number. "We need to have a family meeting," I said when he answered. "There's something about great-grandfather Thomas that you all need to hear." "Mom," he said with that familiar tone of weary patience, "please don't start with the Titanic research again." "We've been through this, Michael," I interrupted, my voice carrying an authority I hadn't felt in years. "This isn't research anymore. This is evidence. And it's going to change everything you think you know about our family." The silence on the other end of the line told me everything I needed to know. For the first time in decades, my son was actually listening to me. Tomorrow, the rest of the family would have no choice but to listen as well. The modern family trust documents lay at the center of the dining room table like a roadmap of everything that was about to change. I'd requested copies from the family attorney, ostensibly to update my own estate planning, but actually to understand exactly how Thomas's stolen wealth had been structured to benefit his descendants. The trust had been established in 1928, years after Thomas's arrival in America. By that time, he'd successfully laundered his criminal proceeds into legitimate investments, creating a financial foundation that would support the Whitmore family for generations. The document listed properties, business interests, and investment accounts that were all ultimately traceable to the money he'd stolen from his English victims. "Mom, what's all this about?" Michael asked as he entered the dining room. Patricia, trailing behind him with her usual expression of barely concealed irritation. "You said it was urgent, but this looks like your usual collection of old papers." I'd spent the morning arranging the evidence in chronological order, creating a presentation that would be impossible to dismiss or interrupt. The trust documents sat at the center, surrounded by insurance claims, bank records, passenger manifests, and correspondence that told the complete story of Thomas Whitmore's deception. "Please sit down," I said, gesturing to the chairs I'd arranged around the table. "Both of you. What I'm about to tell you will change everything you think you know about our family." Patricia rolled her eyes as she took her seat. "Dorothy," Honestly, can't this wait? We have the charity board meeting this afternoon, and I really don't have time for another lecture about ancient history. This isn't ancient history, I said, my voice carrying an authority that made both of them look at me with surprise. This is criminal history, and it's going to affect every aspect of our present and future. Michael's expression shifted from annoyance to concern. Mom, what are you talking about? You're starting to worry me. I picked up the passenger manifest for the SS Mauritania, the document that had started this entire revelation. Thomas Whitmore, your great-great-grandfather, was never on the Titanic. He was on a completely different ship, arriving in Boston 3 days before the disaster was even reported in American newspapers. The silence that followed was deafening. Patricia's face went through a series of expressions: confusion, disbelief, and finally anger. Michael simply stared at the document, his legal training helping him understand the implications faster than his wife. That's impossible, Patricia said finally. We have death certificates, insurance settlements, family correspondence, all fabricated. I interrupted, pulling out the insurance claims. Thomas filed fraudulent claims with 3 different companies, collecting money for losses that never occurred. He used the Titanic disaster as cover for insurance fraud, identity theft, and embezzlement. I laid out the evidence systematically, the same way I'd organized it for my own understanding. The passenger manifest showing Thomas on the Mauritania, the immigration records showing his arrival in Boston, the banking documents showing his rapid establishment of significant assets, the insurance claims describing fictional losses. This is insane, Patricia said, her voice rising. You're talking about forgery, fraud. These are serious criminal allegations. You can't just— I'm not making allegations, I said calmly. I'm presenting evidence, documentary evidence that's been authenticated by maritime historians and museum curators. This isn't speculation or theory, these are facts. Michael had been studying the documents with increasing alarm. His legal background made him capable of understanding the implications faster than Patricia, and his expression was growing more grave with each piece of evidence. Mom, he said quietly, where did you get these documents? The Maritime Museum. They were donated by a collector's estate in England. Dr. Sarah Chen, the curator, contacted me because of my expertise in Titanic passenger records. She thought I was helping with legitimate historical research. She had no idea what we were actually uncovering. I pulled out the correspondence between Thomas and his business partners, the letters that revealed his calculating approach to fraud. Thomas wasn't just a victim of circumstances, he was a career criminal. He fled England to avoid prosecution for embezzlement and fraud. He abandoned his real wife and 3 children, letting them believe he was dead, while he built a new life in America. Patricia's face had gone pale. His real wife? What are you talking about? Eleanor Whitmore, the woman he married in Boston in 1913, was his second wife. His first wife, also named Eleanor, was still alive in Liverpool, struggling to raise their 3 children on her own. Thomas used his first wife's name to court his second wife, romanticizing the woman he'd abandoned. The family portrait from 1910 suddenly took on new meaning. Patricia had always been proud of that portrait, using it as a centerpiece for family gatherings and charity events. Now it represented evidence of abandonment and fraud. This is impossible, Patricia repeated, but her voice lacked conviction. The family has been in Boston for over a century. We have social standing, charitable foundations, business relationships, all built on stolen money, I said, pulling out the property deeds, the Beacon Hill mansion, the shipping warehouse, the summer estate in Newport, all purchased with money Thomas stole from English pensioners and investors. Michael had been quiet, studying the trust documents with growing alarm. Mom, he said, finally, if what you're saying is true, then everything we own, everything we've inherited, is the proceeds of crime. I finished. The family fortune, the properties, the investments, all of it traces back to money Thomas stole from his victims. The weight of the revelation was beginning to sink in. Patricia's carefully constructed world was collapsing around her. The charitable work she'd done, the social standing she'd cultivated, the reputation she'd built, all of it was founded on the crimes of an ancestor who'd used genuine tragedy to cover his theft. This can't be true, Patricia whispered, but she was staring at the documents with horrified fascination. The Titanic Memorial Fund, the Survivor Scholarship Program, we've been running charity events for years based on great-grandfather's sacrifice, a sacrifice that never happened, I said. Thomas Whitmore didn't die saving women and children. He didn't go down with the ship. He was never on the ship. He was a criminal who used the disaster to escape justice and build a new life on his victims' suffering. Michael had been reading through the insurance claims with growing alarm. Mom, these amounts, they're enormous for 1912. He collected enough money to buy half of downtown Boston, and he used it to do exactly that, I replied, pulling out the business records. The shipping company, the real estate investments, the social connections, all of it was built with stolen money. Thomas didn't just commit fraud, he used fraud to establish himself as a pillar of Boston society. Patricia was shaking her head, still struggling to process the implications. But the family stories, the documents we've preserved, the social history, all carefully constructed fiction, I interrupted. Thomas was intelligent enough to create a complete false identity, including fabricated correspondence and manufactured evidence. He spent years building a mythology that would protect him from investigation. The trust documents told their own story of how Thomas had structured his stolen wealth to benefit future generations. The foundation he'd established in 1920 had been designed to provide ongoing income for his descendants while protecting the principal from legal challenges. He'd essentially created a criminal enterprise disguised as a family legacy. Dorothy, Patricia said, her voice barely above a whisper. What are we supposed to do with this information? Our entire identity, our social standing, our charitable work, everything is connected to Thomas's reputation. For the first time in decades, I felt a surge of vindication. The same woman who'd dismissed my research as ancient history was now asking me for guidance about how to handle the truth I'd uncovered. That's exactly what I've been trying to tell you for 40 years, I said, my voice steady but not unkind. These weren't just idle questions about family history. These were legitimate concerns about inconsistencies in our foundation's story. But every time I raised them, I was told to focus on the present instead of dwelling on the past. Michael looked up from the documents, his expression a mixture of shock and grudging respect. Mom, you were right. All those questions you asked, all the research you did, you were uncovering the truth. I was doing what historians do, I replied, following evidence, asking difficult questions, and refusing to accept comfortable lies just because they're easier to believe. The irony wasn't lost on any of us. The family member they'd considered the least relevant, the elderly woman whose expertise they'd dismissed, had uncovered the most important truth about their identity. The ancient history they'd found so tiresome was actually the key to understanding their present circumstances. What happens now? Patricia asked, her voice small and frightened. What do we do with this information? I looked at the two people who'd spent decades treating my research as a harmless hobby. Now they were looking to me for guidance about how to handle the most important crisis in the family's history. Now, I said, we decide whether we're going to continue living a lie or finally face the truth. The photograph from 1915 sat in the center of the table like a smoking gun, its sepia tones capturing a moment that destroyed over a century of family mythology. Thomas Whitmore stood confidently beside a Boston Harbor shipping office, his hand resting on a brass nameplate that read Whitmore Maritime Enterprises. The date stamped on the back was unmistakable, July 15, 1915, 3 years after his supposed death on the Titanic. That's impossible, Patricia whispered, picking up the photograph with trembling hands. He died in 1912. We have death certificates, memorial services, family correspondence mourning his loss, all fabricated, I said, pulling out the systematic evidence I'd organized. This photograph was taken by a commercial photographer to document Thomas's business success. It was probably used for newspaper articles and business promotions. He was very much alive and very proud of what he'd accomplished. Michael had been studying the photograph with his lawyer's eye for detail. Mom, the clothing, the architecture, the photography style, this is definitely from 1915. And there's no question that's the same man from the family portrait. The photograph was devastating in its casual normalcy. Thomas wasn't hiding or skulking in shadows. He was posing proudly for a business photograph, completely confident that his false identity was secure. The man who'd supposedly died heroically on the Titanic was standing in broad daylight, advertising his criminal success. Look at the shipping office behind him, I said, pointing to the background details. You can see the cargo manifests posted on the wall, the business ledgers on the desk, the employees working in the background. This wasn't a man in hiding. This was a successful businessman at the height of his career. I'd spent hours studying every detail of the photograph, and each element told the same story. Thomas had been so confident in his false identity that he'd documented his success publicly. The photograph had probably been displayed in his office, used in business negotiations, and shown to potential investors as proof of his legitimacy. But how did he maintain the deception for so long? Patricia asked, her voice barely audible. Surely someone would have recognized him, questioned his story, investigated his background. That's the genius of his timing, I replied, pulling out the newspaper clippings from 1912. The Titanic disaster dominated international news for months. Everyone was focused on the tragedy, the heroes, the survivors, immigration officials, business partners, social connections. They all saw a man who'd suffered tremendous loss and wanted to help him rebuild. The newspaper coverage had been extensive, and sympathetic articles about Titanic survivors had emphasized their courage, their suffering, and their determination to rebuild their lives. Thomas had understood that claiming to be a survivor would generate sympathy and support that would be invaluable for establishing himself in American society. He was smart enough to play the role perfectly, I continued. He spoke about his lost wife with genuine emotion because he had lost her, just not in the way people assumed. He talked about starting fresh in America with heartfelt conviction because he really was escaping his past. His performance was convincing because parts of it were true. Michael had been examining the business documents that accompanied the photograph. These shipping contracts are enormous. He was moving cargo worth hundreds of thousands of dollars. This wasn't just a small operation. He'd built a major commercial enterprise. The business records showed the scope of Thomas's success. By 1915, Whitmore Maritime Enterprises was one of Boston's largest shipping companies, with contracts throughout New England and international connections that stretched back to Europe. He'd used his stolen capital to establish legitimate businesses that generated enormous profits. But look at the client list, I said, pointing to the names on the shipping contracts. Irish immigrants, Italian workers, Jewish refugees. He was specifically targeting vulnerable populations who couldn't easily verify his background or challenge his practices. The pattern was clear once you understood what to look for. Thomas had identified communities that were grateful for any help navigating American business practices, and he'd systematically overcharged them for services while presenting himself as a sympathetic fellow immigrant who understood their struggles. The charitable donations were part of the strategy, I explained, showing them the records of Thomas's community involvement. He contributed to disaster relief funds, immigrant assistance programs, and church organizations. The donations made him appear generous and community-minded while also providing tax benefits and social connections. Patricia was staring at the photograph with growing horror. The charity work I've been doing, the memorial funds, the survivor scholarship program, all of it is based on a lie. Not just a lie, I corrected. An active deception that hurt real people. While Thomas was building his fortune in Boston, his real wife and children were struggling in poverty in Liverpool. The money he was spending on his new life was money they needed to survive. The moral implications were staggering. Thomas hadn't just committed fraud, he'd created a charitable persona that exploited the same type of suffering he'd inflicted on his own family. He'd donated money to help disaster victims while knowing that his own victims were still struggling with the consequences of his crimes. Michael, I said, pulling out the legal documents, as an attorney, you need to understand the ongoing implications of this evidence. The statute of limitations prevents criminal prosecution, but civil claims might still be possible. The descendants of Thomas's victims could potentially seek restitution from his estate. Michael's face had gone pale. You're talking about our inheritance, our properties, our investments. Everything could be at risk. Everything that was built on stolen money, I confirmed. The Beacon Hill mansion, the shipping warehouse, the charitable foundation, all of it traces back to Thomas's crimes. We're not just inheriting his wealth, we're inheriting his legal liabilities. The photograph seemed to mock us from the center of the table. Thomas's confident smile captured the arrogance of a man who'd successfully transformed himself from criminal to community leader. He'd understood that in America, a tragic backstory and charitable donations could buy respectability and social standing. Dorothy, Patricia said, her voice shaking, how long have you known about this? I've suspected inconsistencies for 40 years, I replied. But I only received documentary proof last week. Every time I tried to discuss my concerns, I was told to stop dwelling on ancient history and focus on the present. The irony was overwhelming. The same people who'd dismissed my research as irrelevant were now confronting evidence that would destroy their present and future. The ancient history they'd found so tiresome was actually the key to understanding their entire identity. All those family gatherings where you tried to tell us about your research, Michael said slowly, you were actually trying to warn us about this. I was trying to follow the evidence wherever it led, I replied. That's what historians do. We ask difficult questions and refuse to accept comfortable lies just because they're easier to believe. The photograph of Thomas Whitmore, taken 3 years after his supposed death, represented more than just evidence of fraud. It was proof that expertise mattered, that difficult questions deserved answers, and that the truth had a way of eventually surfacing, no matter how carefully it was buried. Thomas's confession letter emerged from the manila envelope like a final judgment. Its pages yellowed with age, but its words as sharp and damning as the day they were written. Dr. Chen had found it in the very back of the donated collection, sealed in an envelope marked to be opened only upon my death. Thomas Whitmore, 1923. Can't read this, Patricia said, pushing the letter away after scanning the first few lines. I can't bear to hear what he actually did, but I'd spent a lifetime pursuing historical truth, and I wasn't going to stop now. I picked up the letter and began to read aloud, my voice steady despite the weight of what I was revealing. My dear Eleanor, I began, if you are reading this, then I have finally paid the price for my deceptions. I write this as my final act of honesty, hoping that someone will understand the choices I made and the lives I destroyed in pursuit of my freedom. The letter was dated March 15, 1923, 11 years after Thomas's arrival in America. By that time, he'd established himself as one of Boston's most successful businessmen. But the weight of his crimes had apparently begun to crush him. I was never on the Titanic, I continued reading. I was never a hero. I was a coward who used the greatest maritime disaster in history to escape justice and abandon my family. My name is not Thomas Whitmore, it is Thomas Whitmore, but I am not the man who died on that terrible night. I am the man who should have died, but chose to live as a ghost instead. Michael had been listening with growing horror. He's confessing to identity theft, fraud, abandonment. Everything you've been saying is true. The letter continued with devastating detail, explaining how Thomas had planned his escape from England for months before the Titanic disaster. He'd been under investigation for embezzlement and fraud, facing inevitable prosecution and imprisonment. When news of the Titanic sailing reached him, he'd seen an opportunity to disappear forever. I booked passage on the Mauretania under my real name, I read, knowing that the ship would arrive in Boston before news of the Titanic disaster reached American shores. I calculated that the chaos and confusion following the tragedy would provide perfect cover for a man claiming to be a survivor. The confession revealed the methodical nature of Thomas's deception. He'd studied passenger manifests, memorized details about the Titanic's layout and voyage, and prepared responses to questions about his survival. He'd even practiced telling his story, perfecting the emotional reactions that would convince officials and potential business partners. The money I brought to America was stolen from the pension fund of my shipping company, I continued. Ordinary working people had trusted me with their life savings, their retirement security, their children's futures. I took it all and told myself I deserved it because I was clever enough to escape. Patricia was crying now, her carefully maintained composure finally cracking. Those poor people. They lost everything because of him. It gets worse, I said, turning to the next page of the confession. I abandoned my wife Eleanor and our 3 children, Thomas Jr., Margaret, and little Emily. I let them believe I was dead rather than face the consequences of my crimes. While they mourned my loss and struggled with poverty, I was in Boston, courting another woman named Eleanor, using my first wife's name to create a romantic story about honoring my beloved deceased spouse. The cruelty was breathtaking. Thomas had literally used his abandoned family as inspiration for his false identity, transforming their suffering into a tool for manipulation. He'd told his Boston wife touching stories about his late wife Eleanor, while his real wife Eleanor was still alive, still grieving, still struggling to survive. The business I built in Boston was constructed on fraud, I read. I used my stolen capital to establish Whitmore Maritime Enterprises, but I also used my false identity to exploit immigrants and vulnerable populations. I charged them premium rates for services while presenting myself as a fellow sufferer who understood their struggles. The letter detailed specific examples of Thomas's exploitation. Irish immigrants who'd paid triple the normal rates for shipping services, Italian workers who'd been overcharged for cargo handling, Jewish refugees who'd been manipulated into unfavorable business arrangements. All of them had trusted Thomas because of his tragic backstory. I created a charitable persona to cover my crimes. I continued. I donated money to disaster relief funds and immigrant assistance programs, not out of genuine compassion, but to establish my reputation and gain social connections. Every dollar I gave away was money I'd stolen from people who needed it more than I did. Michael was studying the letter with his lawyer's eye for detail. Mom, this is a complete confession. He's admitting to multiple felonies, documenting his methods, even naming specific victims. This is the most thorough criminal confession I've ever seen. He was dying, I said, looking at the final pages of the letter. By 1923, Thomas was suffering from what we'd now recognize as severe depression and anxiety. The weight of his deceptions had begun to destroy him mentally and physically. The confession revealed that Thomas had been seeking medical treatment for what doctors called nervous exhaustion and traumatic memories, but his trauma wasn't from surviving the Titanic, it was from the guilt of his crimes and the constant fear of discovery. I have lived for 11 years as a ghost, I read, inhabiting the identity of a dead man while my real self slowly died, from shame and fear. I have built a fortune on suffering, established a reputation on lies, and created a family legacy that is poisoned at its very foundation. The letter concluded with instructions that were both practical and devastating. Thomas had established a trust fund for his abandoned family in England, using a portion of his stolen wealth to provide for the wife and children he'd left behind. But he'd also included detailed instructions for covering up his crimes. I instruct my executors to maintain the fiction of my Titanic survival. I read, the truth would destroy too many innocent people, my American family, my business partners, the community that has accepted me. Let the lie continue. Let the ghost remain dead. The final instruction was the most chilling. Destroy this letter. After reading it, let no one discover the truth about Thomas Whitmore. Some secrets are too dangerous to survive. But the letter hadn't been destroyed. It had been preserved in a collector's archive for over a century, waiting for the right moment to emerge and expose the truth. Dorothy, Patricia said, her voice barely a whisper, what are we going to do? How do we live with this knowledge? I looked at the confession letter, then at the two people who'd spent decades dismissing my research as ancient history. They were now confronting evidence that would change everything they thought they knew about themselves. We're going to do what we should have done 40 years ago, I said. We're going to face the truth. The insurance fraud documentation spread across Michael's law office desk like evidence at a crime scene. He'd insisted on reviewing the legal implications privately before we proceeded, and his expression had grown increasingly grave as he studied each document. Mom, this is worse than I initially thought, he said, looking up from Thomas's confession letter. We're not just dealing with historical fraud, we're dealing with ongoing criminal enterprise. The money Thomas stole has been generating income for over a century. I'd spent the morning organizing the evidence by legal category, separating the criminal fraud from the civil liabilities. The insurance claims alone represented multiple felonies: identity theft, wire fraud, conspiracy to defraud, and filing false claims. In 1912, those crimes had carried prison sentences of up to 20 years. The statute of limitations prevents criminal prosecution, Michael continued, but civil claims are a different matter entirely. The descendants of Thomas's victims could potentially seek restitution from his estate, and that includes everything we've inherited. The legal implications were staggering. Thomas's stolen assets had been invested in properties and businesses that still generated income for the family. The Beacon Hill mansion, the shipping warehouse, the charitable foundation, all of it could be subject to civil claims from the families of his victims. What about the trust fund? I asked. The legal structure Thomas established to protect his wealth. Michael's expression was grim. Trust law has exceptions for assets obtained through criminal activity. If we can prove that the original funding came from theft and fraud, the entire structure could be invalidated. We could lose everything. The insurance fraud documentation was particularly damning. Thomas had filed claims with Hartford Insurance, Boston Mutual, and Atlantic Maritime Insurance, collecting over $15,000 in fraudulent settlements. In today's currency, that represented over $400,000 in stolen money. The insurance companies are still in business, Michael said, studying the policy documents. They could potentially seek recovery of the fraudulent payments, plus interest and penalties. We're talking about millions of dollars in potential liability. But the insurance fraud was just the beginning. Thomas's business practices in Boston had created additional legal exposure. The shipping contracts showed systematic overcharging of immigrants and vulnerable populations, business practices that would be considered fraudulent by today's standards. Look at these cargo manifests, I said, pointing to the documentation of Thomas's exploitation. He was charging immigrants triple the normal rates for shipping services, then using his tragic backstory to justify the premium pricing. Michael nodded grimly. Consumer fraud, predatory business practices, exploitation of vulnerable populations. These contracts were executed today. They'd result in massive civil penalties and criminal charges. The business records revealed the scope of Thomas's ongoing criminal enterprise. He hadn't just committed fraud and disappeared. He'd used his stolen capital to establish legitimate businesses that continued to exploit people. The shipping company had operated for over 50 years, generating profits that were ultimately traceable to Thomas's original crimes. The charitable foundation is particularly problematic, Michael said, reviewing the trust documents. Thomas established it using stolen money, then used the foundation to launder additional profits from his fraudulent business practices. The entire structure is tainted. The foundation had been Patricia's pet project for 20 years. She'd used it to support disaster relief programs, immigrant assistance initiatives, and maritime safety research. Learning that every dollar she'd donated had been stolen from the very people she'd been trying to help was devastating. What about the property in England? I asked. The trust fund Thomas established for his abandoned family. Michael pulled out the international banking records. That's another legal nightmare. He used stolen money to establish a trust fund for his English family, but he did it through Swiss banks to avoid detection. The transactions were designed to hide the source of the funds. The Swiss banking records showed that Thomas had been more sophisticated than we'd initially realized. He'd established multiple accounts in different countries, moving money through complex transactions that would be difficult to trace. The man was a criminal mastermind, not just an opportunistic fraud. The English family's descendants could have claims on both sides of the Atlantic, Michael continued. They could seek recovery of the trust fund assets, plus damages for the abandonment and emotional suffering Thomas caused. The legal implications extended beyond financial liability. The Whitmore family's reputation in Boston society was built on Thomas's supposed heroism and charitable legacy. If the truth became public, the scandal would destroy their social standing and potentially impact their ongoing business relationships. The shipping warehouse is still operating, I said, thinking about the family's continuing business interests. The board of directors, the employee pension fund, the supplier relationships, all of it could be affected if this information becomes public. Michael's face was pale. We're looking at potential lawsuits from multiple parties. The insurance companies, the descendants of Thomas's victims, the current business partners who've been unknowingly associated with criminal proceeds, and possibly government agencies seeking to recover fraudulent tax benefits. The tax implications were particularly complex. Thomas had claimed charitable deductions for donations made with stolen money, effectively using his victims' assets to reduce his tax burden. The IRS might seek to recover those fraudulent deductions, plus interest and penalties spanning over a century. There's also the question of international law, Michael said. Thomas committed crimes in England, then fled to America to escape prosecution. There might be treaty obligations or international legal agreements that could affect how we handled this situation. The documentation showed that Thomas had been wanted by Liverpool Metropolitan Police for questioning about the collapse of Whitmore Brothers Shipping Company. The warrant had remained active for years, suggesting that the English authorities had never closed the case. Michael, I said, what happens if we do nothing? If we simply keep this information private and continue living as we have? His expression was troubled. That's not really an option, Mom. Dr. Chen at the Maritime Museum has copies of these documents. They're historically significant, and they'll eventually become part of the public record. We can't suppress this information, we can only decide how to handle it. The legal advice was clear. We needed to consult with specialists in international law, criminal defense, and estate planning. The potential liability was too complex for any single attorney to handle, and the implications extended far beyond our immediate family. What about Patricia's charity work? I asked. The memorial funds, the survivor scholarships, the disaster relief programs. Michael's expression was pained. All of it will need to be reviewed. If the funding came from criminal proceeds, we might need to shut down the programs and potentially return donated funds to their sources. The irony was overwhelming. Patricia had spent 20 years doing charitable work that honored Thomas's supposed sacrifice, using money that had been stolen from the very people she'd been trying to help. The memorial funds were memorializing a fraud, and the survivor scholarships were funded by someone who'd exploited genuine survivors. So what do we do? I asked. Michael looked at the pile of evidence, then at me. We do what you've been trying to get us to do for 40 years, Mom. We face the truth. The family lawyer's letter arrived by courier the next morning. Its formal letterhead and urgent tone revealing how quickly news of my discovery had spread through the Whitmore family network. Patricia had clearly been making phone calls, and the family's response was swift and predictable. Mrs. Simmons, the letter began, we represent the Whitmore Family Trust, and have been made aware of certain historical documents that you claim to have discovered. We strongly advise you to cease any further investigation or discussion of these matters pending legal review. I read the letter aloud to Michael over breakfast, my voice steady despite the obvious threat. The family was attempting to silence me through legal intimidation, the same way they'd been dismissing my research for decades. But this time, I had documentation they couldn't ignore. They're scared, Michael said, studying the letterhead. Davidson, Porter, and Associates are the most expensive law firm in Boston. The family is taking this very seriously. The letter continued with barely veiled threats about confidentiality agreements, estate law, and potential litigation. The family lawyers were clearly hoping to prevent any public disclosure of Thomas's crimes, protecting the Whitmore reputation at all costs. We understand your desire to pursue historical accuracy, the letter continued, but must remind you that the family's privacy and reputation are at stake. Any public disclosure of unverified allegations could result in significant legal consequences for all parties involved. The phrase unverified allegations was particularly galling. I'd spent decades being dismissed as a senile old woman whose research didn't matter. Now the same family was trying to characterize documented evidence as mere allegations. Look at this, I said, pointing to the letter's final paragraph. They're offering to compensate me for my research efforts in exchange for signing a non-disclosure agreement. They're trying to buy my silence. Michael's expression was troubled. Mom, they're offering substantial money. Enough to secure your retirement, pay for long-term care, ensure your financial security for the rest of your life. The amount was indeed substantial, more money than I'd ever seen in one place. But the offer came with conditions that would effectively erase everything I'd discovered. I would be required to turn over all documents, cease any further research, and never discuss my findings with anyone outside the family. They want me to pretend this never happened, I said. To go back to being the irrelevant old woman whose expertise doesn't matter. The phone rang as I was finishing the letter. Patricia's voice was tight with barely controlled panic when I answered. Dorothy, we need to talk. The family has been discussing your research, and we think we can reach a reasonable accommodation. An accommodation? I asked. Is that what we're calling the truth now? Please don't be dramatic. We're talking about ancient history that affects real people in the present. Your son, your grandchildren, the employees of our businesses, the beneficiaries of our charitable foundation, all of them could be hurt if this information becomes public. The emotional manipulation was expertly done. Patricia was using my love for my family and my concern for innocent people to pressure me into silence. But I'd spent 40 years being manipulated by people who claimed to know what was best for everyone. Patricia, I said, innocent people have already been hurt. Thomas's crimes destroyed lives, and covering them up doesn't make the damage disappear. But that was over a century ago. The people he hurt are dead. The businesses he defrauded are gone. The only people who can be hurt now are his descendants, people who had nothing to do with his crimes. The argument was seductive in its simplicity. Why should present-day people suffer for the crimes of their ancestor? Why should Michael lose his inheritance, Patricia lose her social standing, and the grandchildren lose their financial security because of something that happened before they were born? Because the truth matters, I said. Because covering up crimes doesn't make them disappear. Because the money you're so worried about losing was stolen from people who needed it. Money that's been legitimately invested and managed for over a century, Patricia replied. Money that's been used for charitable purposes, business development, and community support. Breaking up the family trust wouldn't help Thomas's victims, it would just create new victims. The phone conversation continued for 20 minutes, with Patricia alternating between emotional appeals and veiled threats. She reminded me of my grandson's college tuition, my granddaughter's wedding plans, and Michael's law practice. All of it could be jeopardized if the family's reputation was destroyed. Think about what you're doing to your own family, she said finally. You're destroying people you claim to love because you're obsessed with people who died a century ago. The accusation stung because it contained a grain of truth. My pursuit of historical accuracy would indeed cause real harm to people I loved, but covering up the truth would perpetuate the harm that had already been done. I'm not obsessed with dead people, I replied. I'm committed to historical truth. There's a difference. Is there? You've spent 40 years digging into family history that nobody else cared about. You've ignored your present family in favor of researching your past family. And now you're willing to destroy your living relatives to vindicate your dead research subjects. The psychological manipulation was skillful, but I'd spent decades being told that my expertise didn't matter. I wasn't going to be silenced now by people who'd never respected my work. Patricia, I said, I've spent 40 years being dismissed as a foolish old woman whose research was irrelevant. But my research uncovered the truth about our family's foundation. The questions you found so tiresome were actually the key to understanding our identity. Your identity, she corrected. The rest of us are more concerned with our future than with your vindication. After hanging up, I sat in my kitchen staring at the lawyer's letter. The family was offering me everything I'd supposedly wanted: security, family unity, and peace in my remaining years. All I had to do was sign a document promising to forget everything I'd discovered. But I hadn't spent 40 years pursuing truth just to abandon it when it became inconvenient. I'd been dismissed, patronized, and marginalized by people who claimed to love me. Now they were offering to buy my silence with the same money that had been stolen from Thomas's victims. The irony was perfect. The family wanted to use Thomas's criminal proceeds to cover up Thomas's crimes. They were offering to compensate me with money that had been stolen from people just like me, people whose expertise and concerns had been dismissed by those in power. I picked up the phone and called Dr. Chen at the Maritime Museum. Sarah, I said when she answered, we need to talk about making this information public. The family is trying to suppress it, but the truth needs to be told. Dorothy, she replied, I was hoping you'd say that. The historical community needs to know about this discovery. Are you prepared for what comes next? I looked at the lawyer's letter, thought about Patricia's threats, and considered Michael's concerns about our family's future. Then I thought about 40 years of being dismissed as an irrelevant old woman whose expertise didn't matter. I've been preparing for this moment my entire career, I said. Let's tell the truth. The museum exhibition proposal lay on my desk like a declaration of war against everything my family had believed about themselves. Dr. Chen had worked through the night to create a comprehensive plan for displaying the Thomas Whitmore documents, and her proposal was both academically rigorous and emotionally devastating. Deception at Sea: How the Titanic Disaster Became Cover for Financial Fraud would be the most significant maritime historical exhibition in decades. The proposal outlined display cases showing the forged documents, the real passenger manifests, and the systematic evidence of Thomas's crimes. Interactive displays would allow visitors to compare the official family story with the documented truth. I'd spent the morning reviewing every detail of the proposal, understanding that my approval would irreversibly change everything. Once the exhibition opened, there would be no going back, no possibility of containing the truth within the family. Thomas Whitmore's crimes would become public knowledge, and the Whitmore family legacy would be forever altered. The centerpiece of the exhibition would be Thomas's confession letter, displayed in a climate-controlled case with an audio recording of the complete text. Visitors would be able to hear Thomas's own words admitting to the fraud, abandonment, and systematic exploitation that had built his fortune. The educational value is enormous, Dr. Chen had written in her proposal. This case study demonstrates how criminals have historically exploited public sympathy for personal gain. It also shows the importance of rigorous historical research in uncovering uncomfortable truths. The proposal included plans for a companion documentary, an academic conference, and a book that would examine the broader implications of Thomas's crimes. The story would reach far beyond Boston, becoming a cautionary tale about the dangers of accepting comfortable lies instead of pursuing difficult truths. But the proposal also included practical warnings about the potential consequences of going public. The attention would be intense, legal challenges were inevitable, and the family would face scrutiny that could last for years. My decision to support the exhibition would transform me from a dismissed elderly woman into a reluctant public figure. The phone had been ringing all morning with calls from family members, lawyers, and business associates who'd heard rumors about my discoveries. Patricia had left 3 increasingly desperate voicemails, and Michael had asked me to meet him for lunch to discuss alternatives to public disclosure. I understood their concerns. The exhibition would destroy more than just the family's reputation. It would invalidate their entire sense of identity. They'd spent their lives believing they were descendants of a hero, only to learn they were actually heirs to a criminal enterprise. The moral implications were staggering. The Whitmore family had built their charitable work around honoring Thomas's supposed sacrifice. Patricia had raised money for disaster relief programs using stories about their ancestors' heroism. Michael had served on boards of maritime safety organizations, leveraging the family's reputation for community support. All of it would be revealed as founded on lies. The memorial funds would be exposed as memorializing a fraud. The survivor scholarships would be shown as funded by someone who'd exploited genuine survivors. The disaster relief programs would be revealed as built on money stolen from the very people they claimed to help. But beyond the family's concerns, there was a broader question about historical responsibility. Did I have an obligation to reveal the truth, even if it would cause significant harm to innocent people? Or was there value in preserving comfortable lies that had, over time, generated genuine good works? The answer came to me as I thought about the 40 years I'd spent being dismissed as a foolish old woman whose research didn't matter. The same people who'd mocked my questions were now asking me to suppress the answers I'd discovered. They wanted me to protect their comfortable lies by abandoning the truth I'd spent a lifetime pursuing. I thought about Thomas's real family in England, the wife and children he'd abandoned, the descendants who'd spent over a century believing their ancestor had died heroically. They deserved to know the truth about what had happened to their family. They deserved to understand why their great-great-grandmother had struggled in poverty while Thomas built his fortune in America. I thought about the investors and pensioners Thomas had robbed, the immigrants he'd exploited, and the communities he'd manipulated. Their descendants deserved to know the truth about the crimes that had been committed against their families. They deserved the opportunity to seek whatever justice was still possible after more than a century. I thought about Dr. Chun and the Maritime Museum, about the historical community that relied on rigorous research to understand the past. They deserved access to evidence that would reshape their understanding of one of history's most famous disasters. And I thought about myself, a 73-year-old woman who'd spent her entire career pursuing historical truth, only to be dismissed by her own family as irrelevant. I deserved to see my expertise finally recognized and my questions finally answered. The decision was actually simple. I'd spent 40 years being told that my research didn't matter, that I should focus on the present instead of dwelling on the past. But the past had shaped the present in ways my family couldn't understand. Thomas's crimes had determined their entire identity, their financial security, and their social standing. I picked up the phone and called Dr. Chen. "Sarah," I said when she answered, "I've reviewed your proposal, and I want to move forward with the exhibition. The truth needs to be told." "Dorothy, are you sure? Once we announce this, there's no going back. The media attention will be intense, and your family will face significant scrutiny." "I'm sure," I replied. "I've spent 40 years being dismissed as a senile old woman whose expertise didn't matter, but my expertise led to this discovery, and my research uncovered the truth. The family can't continue living a lie just because the truth is uncomfortable." "What about the legal challenges?" "The family's lawyers will try to stop the exhibition." "Let them try. The documents are historically significant, and they belong in the public record. The family's privacy doesn't override the public's right to historical truth." Dr. Chen's voice carried a mixture of excitement and concern. "Dorothy, I want you to understand what you're committing to. This exhibition will change your life. You'll become the face of this discovery, the expert who exposed one of the most significant maritime fraud cases in history. The irony wasn't lost on me. The same family members who'd spent decades dismissing my expertise were about to watch me become internationally recognized as the historian who'd uncovered the truth about Thomas Whitmore. The ancient history they'd found so tiresome was about to become front-page news. I've been preparing for this moment my entire career, I said. Every question I asked, every inconsistency I noted, every time I was told to stop dwelling on the past, all of it led to this discovery. I'm not going to abandon the truth now because it's inconvenient for my family. The exhibition proposal outlined a timeline that would give the family 6 weeks to prepare for the public announcement. Dr. Chen had structured the process to be as fair as possible, offering the family opportunities to provide their perspective and respond to the evidence. We'll need to interview you extensively, Dr. Chen continued. Your research process, your family's response, your decision to go public, all of it will be part of the historical record. I thought about the research journal that had been my sanctuary for 40 years, filled with questions that nobody in my family had wanted to hear. That journal would become part of the exhibition, showing how a trained historian had systematically uncovered evidence of fraud despite decades of dismissal. I want to include something else in the exhibition, I said. I want to show how family members can suppress historical truth by dismissing expertise they find inconvenient. The Whitmore family's response to my research is part of this story. The proposal already included plans for examining the broader implications of the case, how criminals exploit public sympathy, how families protect comfortable lies, and how historical truth can be suppressed by people who prefer convenient fiction. Dorothy, Dr. Chen said, are you prepared for the possibility that this decision might permanently damage your relationships with your family? I thought about Patricia's dismissive laughter, Michael's embarrassed sighs, and decades of being treated like a foolish old woman with too much time on her hands. My relationships with my family had been damaged for years by their refusal to respect my expertise. My family damaged our relationships when they chose to dismiss my research as irrelevant, I replied. They've spent 40 years telling me that my expertise didn't matter, that I should focus on the present instead of dwelling on the past. Now they're asking me to suppress the most important discovery of my career to protect their comfort. The exhibition would force my family to confront the truth they'd spent decades avoiding. They'd have to acknowledge that the elderly woman they'd patronized had actually been conducting serious historical research. They'd have to admit that the questions they'd found so tiresome were actually the key to understanding their identity. There's one more thing, I said. I want to establish a fund to help locate and compensate the descendants of Thomas's victims. The exhibition should do more than just expose the truth. It should try to address the ongoing consequences of his crimes. Dr. Chen's proposal had already included plans for working with genealogists and international researchers to trace the families of Thomas's victims. The goal was to provide them with information about what had happened to their ancestors and, if possible, connect them with resources for seeking restitution. That's exactly the kind of restorative justice approach that makes this exhibition historically significant, Dr. Chen said. You're not just exposing crimes, you're trying to heal the damage they caused. The Victim Assistance Fund would be funded by donations from museum visitors and, ironically, from the Whitmore Family Trust itself. If the family wanted to maintain any moral credibility, they'd need to contribute to helping the people their ancestor had victimized. When do we make the announcement? I asked. I'll need 2 weeks to finalize the exhibition details and coordinate with the media. Are you ready to become the public face of this discovery? I thought about the 40 years I'd spent being dismissed as irrelevant, the decades of expertise that had been ignored, the lifetime of questions that had finally been answered. I was ready to show the world that historical truth mattered, that expertise deserved respect, and that comfortable lies couldn't survive rigorous investigation. I've been ready for this moment my entire career, I said. Let's tell the truth. The newspaper draft article lay on the conference table like an ultimatum. Its headline stark and uncompromising: Boston Maritime Museum to expose century-old Titanic. Fraud, prominent family built fortune on stolen money. The Boston Globe's investigative reporter had spent 2 weeks verifying every detail of my story, and her article was devastating in its thoroughness. Dorothy, you cannot let them publish this, Patricia said, her voice shaking with a mixture of rage and desperation. Think about what you're doing to your grandchildren, to Michael's law practice, to every person who depends on our family's businesses. The emergency family meeting had been called for 2 p.m., but Patricia had arrived an hour early, bringing copies of the newspaper draft and a team of lawyers. The conference room at Michael's law firm was filled with expensive suits and barely contained panic. "I've thought about it for 40 years, I replied, my voice steady despite the emotional weight of the moment. Every time I asked questions about Thomas's story, I was told to stop dwelling on ancient history, but that ancient history shaped everything about our present." Michael sat at the head of the table, his expression a mixture of professional composure and personal anguish. As an attorney, he understood the legal implications of the newspaper article. As my son, he was struggling with the realization that his mother was about to destroy the family's reputation and financial security. "Mom," he said quietly, "the newspaper article mentions potential criminal charges, civil lawsuits, and government investigations. Are you prepared for the possibility that we could lose everything?" "We already lost everything," I replied. "We lost at the moment Thomas Whitmore decided to build his fortune on theft and fraud. We've been living a lie for over a century." Patricia's composure finally cracked, a lie that supported hundreds of jobs, funded dozens of charities, and provided security for 3 generations of family members. "You're destroying all of that to vindicate your obsession with dusty old documents." The accusation stung because it contained elements of truth. The newspaper article would indeed destroy the family's social standing, jeopardize their business relationships, and potentially trigger legal challenges that could last for years. But covering up the truth wouldn't change the fundamental reality of what Thomas had done. "Those aren't dusty old documents," I said, pulling out Thomas's confession letter. "These are evidence of systematic fraud, identity theft, and the abandonment of a wife and 3 children. The man you've been honoring as a hero was actually a criminal who used genuine tragedy to cover his crimes." The lawyers had been reviewing the evidence with increasing alarm. The senior partner, a man named Davidson, who'd represented the family for 20 years, looked up from the documents with genuine shock. "Mrs. Simmons," he said, "the evidence you've presented is overwhelming. Thomas Whitmore's confession letter alone would be sufficient to prove fraud in any court. The insurance claims, the banking records, the business correspondence, all of it supports your conclusions." Patricia turned on him with fury. "Then stop her. Issue an injunction. Claim the documents are forgeries. Argue that the statute of limitations prevents any action. Do something. The statute of limitations prevents criminal prosecution." Davidson replied, "But it doesn't prevent historical disclosure. These documents are matters of public interest, and the museum has every right to display them." The newspaper article detailed every aspect of Thomas's crimes, from his flight from England to his systematic exploitation of Boston's immigrant communities. The reporter had interviewed Dr. Chen, reviewed the museum's evidence, and consulted with maritime historians who confirmed the authenticity of the documents. "The article mentions that you've been researching this for 40 years, Michael said, reading from the draft. "It describes how the family dismissed your concerns and treated your expertise as irrelevant. Is that really how you want to be remembered? As the woman who destroyed her own family?" "I want to be remembered as the woman who pursued truth despite being dismissed by people who should have supported her," I replied. "The woman who refused to let comfortable lies replace historical facts." The irony of the situation wasn't lost on anyone in the room. The same family members who'd spent decades patronizing me as a senile old woman were now begging me to suppress the most important discovery of my career. They needed my expertise to understand the situation, but they wanted me to abandon my professional integrity to protect their comfort. "Dorothy," Patricia said, her voice breaking, "I know we haven't always appreciated your research, but you're part of this family too. If you destroy us, you're destroying yourself." "I'm not destroying the family," I replied. "I'm revealing the truth about how the family was built." Thomas Whitmore destroyed lives, abandoned his responsibilities, and used genuine tragedy to cover his crimes. Covering up those crimes doesn't make them disappear. The newspaper article included interviews with genealogists who traced the descendants of Thomas's victims. His real family in England, the wife and children he'd abandoned, had living descendants who'd spent over a century believing their ancestor had died heroically on the Titanic. They deserved to know the truth about what had happened to their family. "The article mentions that you're working with the museum to establish a victim assistance fund," Michael said. "Are you planning to give away our inheritance to people who may or may not be related to Thomas's victims?" "I'm planning to do what Thomas should have done: take responsibility for the harm he caused and try to make amends where possible. The Victim Assistance Fund would be funded by donations and potentially, by contributions from the Whitmore family trust. If the family wanted to maintain any moral credibility, they'd need to acknowledge the harm their ancestor had caused and work to address it. This is insane, Patricia said, standing up abruptly. You're willing to destroy 3 generations of legitimate achievement because you're obsessed with a man who died over a century ago. Thomas Whitmore didn't die over a century ago, I corrected. He lived for another 11 years, building his fortune on stolen money and exploiting vulnerable people. The man who died was his fictional identity, the heroic Titanic survivor who never existed. The lawyers had been discussing strategy in hushed tones, but Davidson finally spoke up. Mrs. Simmons, the family is prepared to make a substantial financial offer in exchange for your cooperation in suppressing this information. We're talking about enough money to secure your future and provide for your grandchildren's education. The offer was tempting, more money than I'd ever imagined having, but it came with conditions that would effectively erase everything I'd discovered. I would be required to sign agreements claiming the documents were unreliable, my research was flawed, and my conclusions were unfounded. You want me to lie about my professional findings? I said. You want me to claim that 40 years of research was wrong, that my expertise doesn't matter, that the evidence I've uncovered is somehow invalid. We want you to consider the consequences of your actions, Davidson replied. Not just for the family, but for the community. The Whitmore businesses employ over 200 people. The charitable foundation supports dozens of programs. The social and economic impact of this revelation would be enormous. I thought about the 200 employees who would potentially lose their jobs, the charitable programs that might be discontinued, and the community organizations that depended on Whitmore family support. All of it would be jeopardized by my decision to reveal the truth. But I also thought about the people Thomas had victimized, the investors whose pensions he'd stolen, the immigrants he'd exploited, the family he'd abandoned. They'd suffered real harm so that Thomas could build his fortune, and covering up his crimes wouldn't undo that suffering. I understand the consequences, I said finally. But I also understand that truth matters more than comfort. Thomas Whitmore was a criminal who used genuine tragedy to cover his crimes. The family's prosperity is built on theft and fraud. Covering up those facts doesn't make them less true. The room fell silent as the weight of my decision settled over everyone present. Patricia was crying, Michael was staring at his hands, and the lawyers were already calculating their next moves. The newspaper article will be published tomorrow, I said. The museum exhibition will open next month. The truth about Thomas Whitmore will finally be told. I stood up, gathered my copies of the evidence, and walked toward the door. For the first time in 40 years, I felt like my expertise had finally been recognized, and my questions had finally been answered. The museum exhibition plaque gleamed under the gallery lights, its simple inscription marking the end of over a century of deception, in memory of the actual victims of the RMS Titanic disaster, and in recognition of the ongoing harm caused by those who exploit genuine tragedy for personal gain. 3 months had passed since the Boston Globe article had exposed Thomas Whitmore's fraud, and the public response had been overwhelming. The Maritime Museum's exhibition had drawn visitors from around the world, making it one of the most successful historical displays in the institution's history. Dorothy, the genealogists have confirmed the identities of 12 living descendants of Thomas's abandoned family, Dr. Chen said, reviewing the latest updates from the Victim Assistance Fund. They're planning to travel to Boston next month to see the exhibition and learn about their ancestors' real fate. The Victim Assistance Fund had raised over $500,000 in donations, money that would be used to help the descendants of Thomas's victims research their family histories and, where possible, seek restitution for the harm their ancestors had suffered. The irony wasn't lost on anyone that the fund was supported by people who'd been moved by the very type of genuine tragedy that Thomas had exploited. The legal consequences had been swift and severe. The insurance companies had filed civil suits, seeking recovery of the fraudulent payments, plus interest and penalties. The IRS had opened investigations into the tax deductions claimed for charitable donations made with stolen money. International authorities had begun reviewing the case for potential treaty violations related to criminal proceeds, but the most significant consequence had been the complete collapse of the Whitmore family's social standing. Patricia had been forced to resign from every charitable board, her reputation destroyed by the revelation that her ancestors' heroic story was completely fabricated. Michael's law practice had lost several prominent clients who didn't want to be associated with the scandal. The family has agreed to contribute $200,000 to the Victim Assistance Fund, Dr. Chen continued, though their lawyers made it clear this is to settle potential civil claims, not an admission of moral responsibility. The financial contribution was significant but hardly adequate, given the scope of Thomas's crimes. The Whitmore family trust had been valued at over $50 million, most of it traceable to investments made with Thomas's stolen money. The family was fighting to retain as much of their wealth as possible while making minimal concessions to the victims' descendants. What about the properties? I asked. The Beacon Hill mansion, the shipping warehouse, the other real estate, still in litigation. The family's lawyers are arguing that the properties have been legitimately owned and improved for over a century, that current ownership can't be invalidated by past crimes. But the victims' descendants have filed claims, and the courts will need to determine how to balance competing interests. The legal battles would continue for years, but the moral victory had already been achieved. The truth about Thomas Whitmore was now part of the historical record, and the comfortable lies that had protected his reputation for over a century had been permanently destroyed. The exhibition had attracted international attention, with maritime historians, legal experts, and genealogists traveling to Boston to study the evidence. The case had become a model for how historical research could uncover long-buried crimes and provide justice for victims who'd been forgotten by history. The documentary crew wants to interview you again next week, Dr. Chen said. They're particularly interested in your experience of being dismissed by your family for 40 years, then vindicated by the discovery. The documentary about the case was being produced by the History Channel, with a scheduled air date that would coincide with the anniversary of the Titanic disaster. The program would examine not just Thomas's crimes, but the broader implications of how families and institutions protect comfortable lies instead of pursuing difficult truths. I'd become something of a celebrity in academic circles, invited to speak at conferences about historical research methodology and the importance of following evidence regardless of its implications. The same expertise that my family had dismissed as irrelevant was now being recognized internationally. Dr. Simmons, the museum's director, said, joining our conversation, "We've had inquiries from 3 universities about establishing research chairs in your name. The Whitmore case has demonstrated the importance of rigorous historical investigation." The academic recognition was gratifying, but it came with a personal cost. My relationship with Michael had been severely strained, and Patricia had cut off all contact with me. The grandchildren, now adults, were struggling with the revelation that their family's prosperity was built on crime. "Any word from the English family?" I asked. "They're planning to attend the memorial service next month," Dr. Chen replied. "Thomas's great-great-granddaughter from Liverpool wants to meet you personally. She says her family has wondered for over a century what really happened to their ancestor." The memorial service would honor the actual victims of the Titanic disaster, while also acknowledging the ongoing harm caused by those who'd exploited the tragedy. Representatives from victims' families, maritime historians, and members of the public would gather to ensure that the real story was finally told. "The insurance companies have reached preliminary settlements," Dr. Chen continued, reviewing the legal updates. "They're seeking recovery of approximately $2.3 million in fraudulent payments, adjusted for inflation and interest. The Whitmore family trust will need to pay substantial damages. The insurance settlements would significantly reduce the family's wealth, but they wouldn't eliminate it entirely. The Whitmores would remain financially comfortable, though their social standing would never recover from the scandal." "What about the charitable foundation?" I asked. "It's been restructured and renamed. The new board has committed to transparency about the foundation's origins and dedicated funding to maritime safety research and immigrant assistance programs. They're trying to do genuine good with money that was obtained through harm." The foundation's restructuring was symbolically important, transforming an institution that had been built on lies into one dedicated to truth and justice. The new programs would help the very populations that Thomas had exploited, creating positive outcomes from his criminal legacy. "Dorothy," Dr. Chen said, "I need to ask you something personal. Do you have any regrets about your decision to expose the truth?" I thought about the family relationships that had been damaged, the social standing that had been destroyed, and the comfortable lies that had been replaced by uncomfortable truths. The consequences of my decision had been severe and would continue for years to come. I regret that my family couldn't handle the truth, I replied. I regret that they preferred comfortable lies to historical facts. But I don't regret pursuing the truth or making it public. The exhibition had vindicated 40 years of research that had been dismissed as irrelevant. The questions I'd asked, the inconsistencies I'd noted, and the expertise I'd developed had all been proven correct. The family members who'd patronized me as a senile old woman had been forced to acknowledge that I'd been right all along. The museum is planning to make this a permanent exhibition, Dr. Chen said. The Thomas Whitmore case will be used to teach future generations about the importance of historical truth and the dangers of accepting comfortable lies. The permanent exhibition would ensure that Thomas's crimes weren't forgotten again, that the victims he'd harmed were remembered, and that the lessons of his fraud would continue to educate future generations. The truth would outlast the comfortable lies that had protected his reputation for over a century. Standing in the gallery, surrounded by the evidence I'd spent decades gathering, I felt a sense of completion that had eluded me for 40 years. The questions had been answered, the truth had been told, and justice had finally been served. Dorothy's new research project folder sat on her desk, its contents representing a dozen similar cases of historical fraud that had been brought to her attention since the Whitmore revelation. Museums, universities, and private collectors from around the world had contacted her, seeking expertise in uncovering long-buried deceptions that had shaped family histories and community narratives. Professor Simmons, the letter from Harvard University began, "We have reviewed your work on the Whitmore case and would like to invite you to lead our new Institute for Historical Truth and Justice. Your methodology for uncovering systematic fraud has applications far beyond maritime history." The academic recognition was overwhelming. At 73, I'd become the leading expert in historical fraud investigation, consulted by institutions that had previously dismissed elderly researchers as irrelevant. The same expertise that my family had found tiresome was now being celebrated internationally. The institute would focus on cases where historical narratives had been constructed to hide crimes, protect reputations, or maintain comfortable lies. The Thomas Whitmore case had demonstrated that rigorous investigation could uncover truth even after more than a century of deception. Dorothy, the genealogists have identified 3 more families with similar stories, Dr. Chen said during our weekly meeting. Men who used the Titanic disaster to escape prosecution, abandon families, or hide criminal activities. Your research methodology is being applied to cases across multiple continents. The pattern was more common than anyone had suspected. The Titanic disaster had provided perfect cover for various forms of fraud and deception, as criminals had understood that claiming to be survivors would generate sympathy and discourage investigation. My work had opened a new field of historical research. The Victim Assistance Fund had grown to over $1.2 million, supported by donations from people who'd been moved by the real stories of Titanic victims and outraged by the exploitation of their suffering. The fund was helping descendants of fraud victims research their family histories and, where possible, seek restitution for historical crimes. The English family has established a memorial fund for Thomas's abandoned wife and children, Dr. Chen continued. They want to honor the people who were actually victimized by his crimes, not the fictional hero he pretended to be. The Memorial Fund would support research into the lives of Eleanor Whitmore and her 3 children, documenting their struggles and ensuring that their suffering wasn't forgotten. The real victims of Thomas's crimes would finally receive the recognition they deserved. My relationship with Michael had slowly begun to improve as he'd come to understand the importance of my work. His initial anger had given way to grudging respect for my professional achievement, though he still struggled with the practical consequences of my decision. "Mom," he'd said during our last conversation, "I'm starting to understand why you couldn't let this go. The questions you were asking were legitimate, and we should have listened to you." Patricia remained estranged, unable to forgive me for destroying the social standing she'd spent decades building, but even she had been forced to acknowledge the accuracy of my research, admitting in a newspaper interview that Dorothy's historical work was more thorough than any of us realized. The family's financial situation had stabilized after the legal settlements, though their wealth had been significantly reduced. The Beacon Hill mansion had been sold to help pay restitution to victims' descendants, and the shipping warehouse was being converted into a maritime museum focusing on immigration history. The documentary won an Emmy, Dr. Chen said, showing me the latest industry recognition. Your story is inspiring other elderly researchers to pursue difficult truths despite family pressure to remain silent. The Emmy Award was displayed in the museum's permanent exhibition, alongside Thomas's confession letter and the evidence I'd gathered over 40 years of research. The display had become a pilgrimage site for researchers who'd been dismissed or marginalized by people who preferred comfortable lies to difficult truths. Dorothy, Dr. Chen said, I have something to show you. She pulled out a letter that had arrived that morning, written by a young woman in Australia, whose great-grandfather had supposedly died in a mining accident in 1923. The family had celebrated him as a hero who'd died trying to save his coworkers, but the woman had discovered inconsistencies in the official story. She's asking for your help, Dr. Chen said. She wants to know if her great-grandfather actually died in the accident or if he used it as cover to abandon his family and start a new life elsewhere. The letter was heartbreakingly familiar. A young woman whose questions had been dismissed by her family, whose research had been treated as irrelevant, whose expertise had been marginalized by people who preferred comfortable lies to difficult truths. She needed someone who understood the importance of following evidence, regardless of its implications. I'll help her, I said, adding the letter to my new research project folder. Every family deserves to know the truth about their history, even when that truth is uncomfortable. The work would continue for as long as I was able to pursue it. There were dozens of similar cases, hundreds of families living with lies, thousands of victims whose suffering had been forgotten or exploited. The Thomas Whitmore case had been just the beginning. The Institute wants to establish a fund for elderly researchers who've been dismissed by their families, Dr. Chen said. They're calling it the Dorothy Simmons Fellowship for Historical Truth. The fellowship would provide financial support and institutional backing for older researchers whose expertise had been marginalized. Too many important discoveries had been suppressed because elderly investigators lacked the resources or support to pursue uncomfortable truths. What will you work on next? Dr. Chen asked. I looked at the collection of cases that had been brought to my attention: families built on lies, reputations constructed on fraud, communities that had accepted comfortable fiction instead of difficult truths. Each case represented people whose suffering had been forgotten and criminals whose crimes had been celebrated. All of it, I replied. Every case where truth has been suppressed, every situation where expertise has been dismissed, every instance where comfortable lies have replaced historical facts. The work would be difficult and often heartbreaking. Families would resist investigation, institutions would prefer comfortable lies, and communities would defend narratives that made them feel good about themselves. But the truth mattered more than comfort, and someone needed to ask the difficult questions. Dorothy, Dr. Chen said, what would you say to other elderly researchers who've been dismissed by their families? I thought about the 40 years I'd spent being patronized, the decades of expertise that had been ignored, the lifetime of questions that had been dismissed as irrelevant. I thought about the moment when the Maritime Museum had called, validating everything I'd suspected and vindicating everything I'd researched. I would tell them that their expertise matters, I said, that the questions they're asking are important, that the research they're conducting is valuable, and that the truth they're pursuing is worth defending. The Thomas Whitmore case had taught me that historical truth was worth pursuing, regardless of its personal cost. The family relationships that had been damaged could potentially be repaired, but the lies that had been exposed could never be restored. Truth had a way of surviving even the most determined attempts to suppress it. Keep asking the difficult questions, I continued. Keep following the evidence wherever it leads. Keep refusing to accept comfortable lies just because they're easier to believe. The truth matters, and someone needs to tell it. Looking out at the museum exhibition, surrounded by the evidence I'd spent decades gathering, I felt a sense of purpose that had sustained me through 40 years of dismissal. The questions had been answered, the truth had been told, and justice had finally been served. The work would continue, and the truth would endure.